I don't want to say the wrong thing.
Right. At the end of the day, you need to protect yourself.
Yeah, I don't want to say that I'm guilty or not. I'm just not saying, on finding content at some point, right, at any point in my life.
Hey everyone, it's Katie from Without a Crystal Ball. Welcome back to my channel. I hope you're having a wonderful day. It's Monday, April 18th. So today's the day where the transcripts are now available for the public on the government website if you are interested in finding out all the details about what happened in trial with Josh Duggar. There are 8 volumes of transcripts over which span the multiple day trial, and obviously thousands upon thousands of pages of testimony, in-chamber conversations, sidebars, all of it recorded by the court reporter. So things that we did not hear about in the courtroom on the day of the trial or during the proceedings are now in the transcripts. So we're seeing for the very first time some of these behind the scenes conversations that took place away from the jury as they debated certain aspects of the case during the trial. Now, we know during the trial that Josh Duggar's defense attorneys were going to try to blame other people for potentially being the ones that were caught doing what was found on Josh's computer, and the argument was because it was a work computer. In their opening statements, I looked through, and they brought up multiple former employees, including William Mize, Randall Berry, and Caleb Williams. Now, in the opening statements, they brought up that Caleb Williams was at the car lot in May and that there was indications that he had sold a car. And it seemed like in the very opening of the case, of the trial, that Caleb Williams was going to be who they were going to put the blame on. They were also going to bring up some doubt around Randall Berry and some discussions around the William Mize, the customer. So in the very beginning opening statements, I was like, well, wow, he came out swinging. He's going to bring up all of these people. We're going to get an understanding of who else could have done it. Then we get into the trial. Now in the government's opening statements, they also brought up a lot of names, and they also brought up Randall Berry, and nobody actually called Randall Berry, which I think is weird. Like both the prosecutor and the defense said that they were going to call Randall Berry. None of them, neither side actually called him. So he never testified. William Mize never testified, and Caleb Williams never testified. But now we know why that they never testified. And that's because during a point right before the defense rested, there was an in-chamber conversation between Josh's attorneys, the U.S. attorneys. And they were arguing with the judge about Caleb Williams. This is moments before they rest their case, and moments before Josh Duggar is brought into the chambers with the judge for a one-on-one conversation. Right after their last witness testified, which was like a cop that was part of the initial search of the first property, Justin Roberts goes into the chambers and he wants to try to prevent Caleb Williams from taking the stand. And he basically brings up that they have evidence that proves that Caleb was not at the property on the days in questions. They bring up evidence of his text messages. They reference some emails that were sent to them that were unsolicited by Caleb. They had his mom at court that was willing to testify that he was back home. She had provided photographs of him back home. He was doing engraving back home. He went to a wedding. He was at an Apple store. They even had the Apple people there, like a representative from the store that said that Caleb was at the Apple store getting something to do with his phone. And then he was back in Illinois, and then he went to a wedding. And so they had his whole, the 4 days in May that were on trial for Josh, Caleb was nowhere near. And they were unable to actually establish that he remote accessed in. So the government basically presents to the judge, like, we have proof that he wasn't there. We have his mom here. We have Apple people here. We know that he was nowhere near, and there's no proof to prove that he was remote accessing. There's no proof that any remote accessing ever happened. Josh's attorneys basically were like trying to argue that the government withheld this evidence, that they sat on this evidence. Gelfand tries to bring up that they have proof that in March he sold a car there. And at some point in time, they actually bring up Jed's name. They said this: March 27th of 2019, 6 weeks before this, listing him as a salesperson, he signed it, my understanding, talking about Caleb selling a car, okay? He says, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is the government actually showed him that and he verified. And Dustin Roberts says, I did not show him that. No. Mr. Gelfand says, I believe your agents. It's in your ROI. Well, whatever, doesn't matter. He'll either authenticate that or not. He'll identify Fraser Computing at the bottom of the document, which references Fraser on the HP computer, and that he had involvement with eBay sales. There's already an evidence, Defendant's Exhibit 48, which are emails and shipping labels that he'll testify I anticipate are directly associated to him. And he used Duggar's parents, I meaning Jim, Bob, and Michelle's address as his home in that March and I think April 2019 time period. So establishing that for a couple months, Caleb was living with the Duggars. And he says, and then critically, March 7th of 2019, he sends a text message that he turns over to the government. The government then turns over to us, and that's where we got it from. And the text message that he sends to Josh on May 7th is, should be able to help you a couple days this week on May 7th. And with the happy face, watch the lot. And the lot, we believe, refers to wholesale motor cars lot. That's May 7th time period. And the judge says, did he watch the lot? And then Gelfand says, he has, in response and discovery provided by the government, he said he denied going to the lot. And then he said he didn't mean to mislead anyone. He may have watched the lot. He may have used the computer. He says he doesn't remember, according to the government. And then the court says that's not 602, which they're arguing about a specific rule of the court. This is all according to what the government disclosed in discovery, says Gelfand. And then Robert says, Your Honor, there's more to that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you out. And then he says, on May 9th of 2019, according to the government's ROI, he spends the night at Champion Motor Cars. And the court says, and where is Champion Motor Cars? And he says, a mile and Mr. Roberts says, it's where the fire truck was at, Your Honor. And then the court says, and Champion is a parent company? And Mr. Roberts says, it's his brother's company. The court says his brother's company, and Mr. Gelfand says, Jed Duggar's company. Ownership might technically be different, but essentially it's Jed's car lot. So he spends the night there on May 9th, and he said he might have done odd jobs for the Duggars or for the guys. Mr. Roberts said no, he said Jed specifically, but go ahead. And then Gelfand says we're going, again, based on the government discovery, and then he is what we believe was disclosure of Brady. He turns over an undated, timestamp photo that is presumably he took before an iPhone 8. It appears to be the wholesale motor cars lot of Josh using the MacBook laptop that he seized, that was seized in the case. And the court says take and win. And then Dustin Roberts says, how on earth did you say it was an iPhone 8? There's no metadata. And Gelfand says, oh, I'm sorry. It's on a different, Your Honor. I misspoke. They tried to say that there was literally pictures of a computer screen that they found and that they're trying to establish that he was there. Dustin Roberts then says that they turned over unsolicited emails that he reached out through an attorney and that he had left Jed's car lot on May 11th. Stopped in St. Louis and got a new iPhone, which we have the receipt, and the Apple representative verifying that he was there. They have his mother's, who has photographs of him at her house. They're doing engraving, and then they go to a wedding together. So they have an Apple person there that's also going to be there to testify that they were with Caleb in another state working on his phone in Missouri, in St. Louis. Long story short, the government tells the judge the only reason they want to call Caleb is because he has a registered offense. And the judge then asks, like, what was the offense? And he says he was convicted in early 2020 of having relations with his then whatever they call girlfriend in the belief system. He wanted to know what the relevance of his crimes would be to this. And basically, it comes down to that the judge agreed that they couldn't bring Caleb Williams on because, one, he would confuse the jury by bringing up something that's completely unrelated to this case and using his status on the SO offender list, okay? And he tells them, you can bring Caleb onto the stand. You can ask him if he remote accessed, and if he says no, that's as far as you can go. You can ask him his understanding about technology, but you cannot bring up anything to do with his SO status, period. Because they didn't want to confuse the jury. He wasn't on trial. He wasn't named a defendant. He was not there at the time. So they couldn't do third-party guilt or introducing a third-party perpetrator because they had no proof that he was there, that he did it. All they had was hearsay and speculation. And the government said the only reason you want him is because he's on the list. So it will look like there was someone else that was interested in children. Caleb's charge was related to a 16 or 17-year-old, whereas Josh's were related to toddlers. Little bit different, still bad, but different ages. Once the judge basically shuts them down and says, no, you cannot bring this up, the judge cites a bunch of different legal cases for why he's not going to allow them to go down that rabbit hole of talking about Caleb's crimes. Justin then goes and talks to Josh and says that based on the court's ruling excluding the anticipated testimony that we were intending to attempt to elicit, and with the understanding of that record of what was previously filed in advance of trial, we will not call Caleb Williams for the very limited purpose of what the court would allow us to. Furthermore, Mr. Duggar has elected not to testify in his defense, and my plan at this point is to rest the case in chief. So because they couldn't bring up the status of his prior crimes, they didn't want to bring Caleb on. Now we know that Jed was likely going to probably testify that Caleb was at his house and helped out at his car lot. So once Caleb was not testifying, they couldn't bring on Jed. That's just my basic assumption because it's the only time that Jed's name was brought up. So once the judge finds out that Josh has elected not to actually testify, he wants Josh to come into the chambers with him and have a conversation with him because he wants to hear directly from Josh what his plans are. So he sits down with Josh and he tells him, you have the absolute right to testify in your defense. And Josh said, yes. And he says, and that's just an absolute right you have. Do you understand that? Josh says, yes. He goes over how you can invoke what's called the Fifth Amendment. So you can't be forced to testify, and that no one can force you to take the stand. You don't have to go on the stand to incriminate yourself, and it's your right to just use the Fifth Amendment and not testify. And Josh said he understood that. And he said you can object and you can waive your Fifth Amendment rights and testify if you want to. And you've expressed that you understand that. And he said, correct. He said he understood that. And he said, now with a person in your situation is confronted with whether you should take the stand or not on their Fifth Amendment right to testify, there are a couple of things that you should consider. One of those things is that if you requested, I would advise the jury as part of the jury instructions that the jury may not consider the fact that you did not testify as evidence of anything. In fact, they shouldn't even mention that in their deliberations, okay? You should also, obviously, you've hired very good lawyers, and you should listen to their explanation of these rights. And then he says, have they explained these to you? And Josh says, yes, very clearly. And he says, have they answered any and all of your questions that you've had? And he said, yes. And he said, with the benefit of their explanation, do you believe that you understand both the right not to testify as well as your right to waive the Fifth Amendment and testify? And he said, yes. And he says, have you made a decision as to whether you would like to testify or not? And he said, I would prefer not to testify at this time. And then he says, do you understand that while it's important to listen to your lawyers and to ask them questions, that at the end of the day, it's not their decision, that it's yours if you should testify? And he said, yes, I understand that. And so he wanted to clarify if it was Josh's decision. And Josh said, yes, yes, it's my decision. And then he said, I don't think you're going to have any more questions of me, but do you have any questions about waiving your rights or any questions about your right to testify? And he said, I think those questions have been answered by my attorneys. So Josh leaves the room, and then Gelfand goes out into the courtroom and he rests the case. So Josh's only conversations the entire week in trial with the judge is about whether or not he's going to testify. Josh says, I'm not going to testify. My attorneys have explained everything. We're good. And they had to rest the case because Josh's plans to blame Caleb fell apart because they were able to prove Caleb wasn't there. And now we know why Jed didn't testify, because without Caleb's testimony, they can't bring Jed on to be like the alibi or the witness of, yes, he was at my car lot on these days in questions. And then without Caleb, so Jed's out. We still don't know why they didn't bring up Randall Berry. We also don't know why they didn't call William Mize. I don't really know why they just stopped at that point, but they didn't bring up anyone else at that point and they rested. And they did a rebuttal witness, so they recalled up their expert to rebut some of the testimony of the defense's expert, and then they did their closing arguments. At this point, we know that Josh was convicted of both charges and was remanded into the court custody, and he's currently in Washington County Jail awaiting for his sentencing. So there's a lot to go through here. There is a ton of transcript information, and so if you can bear with me, we're going to go through some of these key moments in the case that we didn't hear about or happened behind closed doors, including a reporter being reprimanded by the court for bringing in a recording device. It happened. All right, you guys, what are your thoughts about this? Tell me in the comments below. Bye, guys.